Welcome to Gray Matters. We are two neurodivergent ladies who hyperfixate and needed a place to share. We created our channel to do just that. Check out our podcast, Fixate Today, Gone Tomorrow, for more deeper dives. Today, let's take a look at South Carolina's law enforcement corruption, as well as search and seizure laws. In the Mica Francis Miller case, frustrations with local police involvement have been rampant. There may be more than one reason for this, but we can't ignore the fact that South Carolina is known to be one of the country's most criminal-friendly states, as well as having significant local law enforcement corruption. Anyone who followed the Alex Murdaugh case saw just how prevalent it can be. Our goal is to demonstrate how such corruption played a role in the Mica tragedy, and even propose a theory on how South Carolina policy and laws might help explain how this could have been a contributing factor in the case. First, we need to give you some background on these issues. Please hang in there and follow along while we work to tie this all back together to the case. With this understanding, we will be able to get one step closer to the big picture. To begin on an optimistic note, the Post-Courier has partnered with small community newspapers or news organizations to investigate potential abuses of power, misuse of taxpayer dollars, and reports of misconduct. Those stories are published in tandem with community partners so that information can reach the widest possible audience. To get a better understanding of the corruption happening in this part of South Carolina, I want to share a couple examples. The first happened in January of 2019. After choir practice, a longtime foreman with the State Department of Transportation stepped out of a small white church near Hartsville and spotted the owner of a local tree service company. The owner had removed a tree along the highway and wanted to get paid, preferably with a DOT credit card. The foreman handed over his state purchase card, and the tree cutter swiped it on the portable reader. He handed $200 of cash to the DOT foreman for giving his company work. The DOT employee refused. He said he'd taken some cash a year before and that decision had weighed on his conscience. So there in the church parking lot, the tree cutter put the money on the ground and left. Moments like these create choices. While many public servants in South Carolina do their jobs with honor and diligence, more than 1,100 educators, law enforcement officers, judges, and state employees made decisions since 2018 that clearly crossed the lines, an uncovered investigation revealed. These 1,100 plus cases represent a gray zone of ethical breaches, cases that often don't make headlines. You'll find them in the files of South Carolina's many self-policing boards and panels. They involve small offenses and large, but all share one thing in common: moments when people in public positions made decisions that violated laws or professional standards. These ethical breaches sometimes lead to criminal charges, such as those against 6 Orangeburg County officers who were convicted in a bribery scheme to protect what they thought were Mexican drug shipments. But most officials ended up avoiding handcuffs and instead were reprimanded or saw their work licenses suspended. This lack of transparency represents a missed opportunity to establish a stronger culture of accountability. Experts in fraud say that deterring future misconduct begins with clear rules and highly visible consequences when people break those rules. For many years, researchers believed that misconduct was rooted in poverty and parental influences, that criminal parents spawned future crooks. This consensus has changed, replaced with a new hypothesis that criminal conduct wasn't necessarily rooted in genetics or parenting. Rather, it was learned like a language or skill. Environmental factors such as peer pressure and a culture of dishonesty often were more important corruption triggers. Most fraudsters don't have criminal records. They pay their taxes, and a lot of times they worked for government agencies or companies for years. They think of themselves as law-abiding until the point they cross the line. What you often hear is that people get trapped in a crime. It weighs on them every day. They worry that today is the day someone is going to catch me. The Criminal Justice Academy has no searchable roster of misconduct cases. The Ethics Commission has a simple list, one that doesn't describe violations, officials' titles, or where they served. Flawed oversight has allowed judges to keep complaints buried and avoid any discipline whatsoever. A 2019 series called The Untouchables by the Post and Courier and ProPublica showed not a single circuit judge has been publicly disciplined for misconduct in decades, despite more than 1,000 complaints. We also need to recognize the crew at the podcast True Sunlight, previously known as the Murda Murder Podcast. They consist of a small team of journalists who uncovered crimes associated with Alec Murdaugh. Many of these agencies are self-policing, so you need a law that says you have to put investigations on a website in a month or something like that. It has been said that reducing corruption starts with trying to reduce corruption. South Carolina should start. So does law enforcement and judicial corruption play a role in this case? I don't see how it couldn't. If we just look through some of the people who are involved, or at least adjacent to those involved, combined, they have tremendous amount of criminal activity. Although again and again, we hear about this person being pardoned, or having a mistrial, or cutting a deal. With all the things they have done, they are all out and free, and for the most part, living a life without limitations. I'm really curious to know, how many people do you know who have committed crimes on this level? I've been trying to think about this in my own life, and it's not many. Okay. Let's move forward and look at a few of the players involved and their criminal past. Again, it is uncanny the number of times we have heard about pardons, mistrials, dismissals, special deals, and general lack of consequences with these people. You can't help but to ask yourself, if the South Carolina legal system was more transparent and consistent in enforcing consequences, could this tragedy have been avoided?
To their leads. So I have FOIA'd these documents from the Myrtle Beach Police Department. I got back about 14 different police reports, and what they show is that there's this pattern of just all this troubling behavior over the course of several years, but mostly in the past 6 months, the events started ticking up.
Let's take a look at the past of just a few of those involved. Obviously, starting with JP. He has been accused of committing sex acts with children and being addicted to prostitutes. He has admitted to stalking, using illegal drugs, as well as misusing prescription drugs, threats with firearms, and more than I can even count. He also has a significant record, including a series of alcohol and cannabis-related cases, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, an arrest for hitting a woman with a car twice, and then being pardoned so that he is allowed to purchase firearms that he later used to threaten people. Moving on to his father, Wayne. He is linked to 2 suspicious fires at vacant churches he owned. There is Bernard Kennerson, who was charged with indecent acts with another. Granted, that was back in 1991. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot about Trisha Ross, who stole money from the dollar store when she worked there. Obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg for those mentioned, as well as others I didn't even get to. Also, it must be said that some of these crimes are far worse than others, and some of these people paid their debt to society and deserve a second chance. Okay, so where to start next? When the surveillance videos were first released, there was much speculation about Mica being followed. Now, we can talk about that later, but at the time, there was speculation about a gentleman in a green t-shirt seen at the pawn shop, who many people found suspicious. It was suggested that he looked like a local chief of police named Keith Grice. Now, I have no reason to believe that is who the guy is in the video, but regardless, I went ahead and started researching him. To be clear, I found nothing sinister about Keith Grice himself, but instead about the person he was replacing as the chief of police in Manning, South Carolina, a guy named Blair Schaefer. Grice replaced Blair Schaefer, who was fired in July 2018 in what city officials deemed at the time as in the best interests of the city. In the announcement, Mayor Nelson wrote that the safety of our residents, guests, and community is of utmost importance. Schaefer fought his termination by asking for a hearing before the city's grievance committee. Though the grievance committee ruled in favor of reinstating Schaefer, members of Manning City Council voted to reaffirm their decision to terminate his employment. On January 7th, FBI agents arrested Schaefer on multiple federal charges, including money laundering, theft of federal funds, and providing. As chief of police, Schaefer had unfettered access to the Manning Police Department's facilities and evidence rooms. On September 12, 2015, following a traffic stop in which drugs and nearly $80,000 in cash were seized, the drugs and money were placed in the Manning Police Department's evidence room. Beginning a week later, Schaefer began making large cash deposits ranging from between $500 and $5,000 in a series of separate transactions. Between September 19, 2015 and November 10, 2015, Schaefer deposited over $78,000 in cash into his personal banking account. All of the money was stolen from the evidence room. After a tip was reported to the FBI, Schaefer was contacted by law enforcement officers and falsely denied stealing the money. He deceived officials a second time before ultimately being charged with and pleading guilty to theft of government funds and making false statements to law enforcement. United States Judge Bruce Hendricks sentenced Schaefer to 1 year and a day in federal prison, to be followed by a 1-year term of court-ordered supervision. Quote, "Those who are sworn to uphold the law must lead by example. The defendant here dishonored his oath, violated the public's trust, and deserved his federal prison sentence," said U.S. Attorney McCoy. As this case shows, no one is above the law. This office will not allow those who are supposed to protect our community to take advantage of the people of South Carolina. Two things about this crime stick out to me. First, at the local level, the grievance committee ruled in favor of reinstating Schaefer, and it wasn't until the FBI became involved that he was fully investigated and found guilty of his crime. This is interesting to me because as we go through many of these cases in South Carolina, we see a pattern of lack of activity on the local level by police. Going back to our initial civics lesson, it seems likely this could have something to do with local corruption. In South Carolina, on a state level, the State Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, is in place to oversee larger criminal cases in addition to the local police. We heard about SLED a lot in the Alec Murdaugh case. In that case, there was a lot of suspicion about SLED itself being involved. Now, I researched and I did find a few questionable investigations on the part of SLED, but definitely less than those at the local level. The next enters the FBI. Once they get involved, all these side deals and corruption and buying off of local enforcement is totally off the table. The FBI will get to the bottom of things and don't care about who has local clout in these towns. The second thing that stuck out was the practice of search and seizure of property and the corruption that was possible because of South Carolina's specific policies and laws regarding this practice. Now, we need to learn a little bit more about this. Again, hang in there. We really will get back to how this all matters in the Mica Miller. Okay, another civics lesson. But please do stick with me. I promise in the end, this is all relevant and will be very interesting. So, in South Carolina, warrants are not needed to search a car. And there's a process called civil asset forfeiture that grants law enforcement officers the authority to take possession of property simply because they suspect that the property was used to commit a crime. Property owners don't have to be suspected, charged, or convicted of criminal conduct for law enforcement to take their belongings.
Under Operation Rolling Thunder, any traffic violation can lead to a roadside interrogation and a warrantless search. Police stop drivers for minor things like following too closely or drifting over the white line. But the goal is not safer streets. It's to pull over and search as many vehicles as possible. And when the police find cash, they seize it, whether there's evidence of wrongdoing or not.
Furthermore, for others, keeping pizza delivery tips in cash or committing minor traffic violations has led to the seizure of valuables because the officers believe the cash or property was connected to a crime. It's important to know that civil asset forfeiture in South Carolina disproportionately harms low-income communities and people of color. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that in this show, but definitely we need to look back into it. So once something has been seized, the recovery process is onerous, placing the burden on individuals to pay for their own attorneys and to navigate opaque judicial procedures. Because the process is civil rather than criminal, poor property owners do not have a constitutional right to a lawyer to help them. The impact of the system isn't just discriminatory, it's lucrative. Police are incentivized to steal property, and prosecutors are incentivized to litigate to keep the property because 95% of the money they collect through forfeiture goes straight into their own budgets. It's no wonder civil asset forfeiture has earned the nickname policing for profit. In roughly 3 years, South Carolina law enforcement accumulated over $17 million, with 75% going to the police agencies and 20% going to the prosecutors. competitions even exist for the biggest and greatest number of seizures made. In South Carolina and beyond, law enforcement agencies upgrade their cars, fly first class, and buy absurd amounts of Gatorade with forfeiture funds. Really have no idea on the Gatorade. Supporters of the practice claim that it allows them to thwart wealthy drug and gang kingpins and fight more high-level crimes with the proceeds. Police are mostly accruing millions, a few $100s at a time, by seizing small amounts of money and property from poor people. Civil asset forfeiture subverts constitutional principles, like protections against unreasonable search and seizures, the presumption of innocence, and the right to due process. Also, here is something to think about. If police are seizing $100 or so at a time, is anyone really going to go through the difficulty of reclaiming it, or just going to let it go? Law enforcement is known for keeping terrible records of the seized money, and are basically at their own discretion to report it. It sure seems possible that it would be easy for law enforcement officers to pocket a little bit of the money for a bit of extra income. Now, that's not an accusation, but it is something to think about. Just a bit more, I promise. So, civil forfeiture initially gained prominence in the 1970s and 80s as a means of targeting drug dealers by enabling law enforcement to seize both their criminal proceeds and the property that they use to further illegal activity. At the time, the Federal Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention Control Act of 1970 permitted law enforcement to seize illegal narcotics and the equipment that they suspected criminals used to manufacture or transport them. Since then, however, law enforcement's use of civil forfeiture has expanded dramatically at both the federal and state levels to enable the use of civil forfeiture in virtually all cases of suspected criminal activity. As we spoke about before, once property is seized, it goes through forfeiture proceedings. The expense of hiring an attorney in order to get that property back often exceeds the amount that the property itself is worth. Thus, many property owners allow for the forfeiture of their property by signing a consent order. Consent orders have some built-in protections. They must be signed by the owner, any involved law enforcement agencies, lawyers, or interested parties, such as lien holders, and then must be approved by a judge. Despite this, consent orders are another area for potential abuse by law enforcement agencies, who can seize cash or other valuables in targeted traffic stops and tell the property owner to sign a consent order on the spot, denying them any chance for due process. But let's think about it another way. Okay, so this is a bad and corrupt process which is misused. But let's think about another way it could be misused. Say you are a known drug dealer in the area, or really a trafficker or smuggler at any level. You have a stack of money sitting on the front seat, give the officer a knowing wink, the officer seizes that money, the driver easily complies with signing the consent order saying they will not follow up on the matter, and drives away. The officer is left with a stack of money in hand, but never searches the rest of the vehicle for cash or drugs in the trunk, for instance. No questions to the people in the car that he is transporting, which theoretically may be full of people being trafficked. Everyone walks away happy. Okay, I think now is the time we should talk about JP and his friends and the absurd number of traffic violations they have all been found to have. I wish I was smart enough to know how to look up traffic violations in South Carolina, but unfortunately, I'm not. So I'm going to count on those other YouTubers out there who are and keep reporting that they have a lot. Agatha May's detective agency site is great at looking into this. So hopefully she doesn't mind me snagging a few of her numbers. By the way, it's a great channel if you haven't already seen it yet. Everyone's been focused on how they get away with this and still have their licenses. Personally, I wonder what their insurance rates must be. The general consensus is that they have so much weight in town that they believe they are above the law. If one was seeking local police protection to let some criminal activity slide, or at least for them to look the other way, might a traffic stop with a wad of cash on the seat, a knowing wink, and a quickly signed consent form be a great way of paying off police in a somewhat legal way with a paper trail that was not obvious. Thanks for watching. For a deeper dive, check out our podcast, Fixate Today, Gone Tomorrow. Bye.